All right, thanks guys for coming. Other than I'm Jabez Abraham, work in Asurion on the cloud security side. Other than those who represent Asurion here, who else who uses the cloud? I know Asurion does a lot. You guys do that. All right, so. I sort of count. Yeah, because you moved, so. So it's great. Thanks again for coming. I think hopefully it'll be informative. Some of that may just be a level set where you get a better understanding of how to think about security. We'll have different thought process that kind of helps with that. And then as we go through it, you'll kind of see how it all ties together. There's a lot of content I would like to share. I won't be able to go through each point because there's a lot of information there. Of course, if you have any questions afterwards, be more than happy to spend time with you. So when we think about serverless, again, this is about Asurion. We do insurance, phones, retail, and we're all over the world. So that's kind of, that brings up a little bit of a different paradigm where we have to deal with not just US, we have to deal with other country laws as well, like Japan, Korea. So we've been doing a lot of stuff with different regions which have very, very different rules than what you would expect in the US. So today we'll kind of focus on some key areas about serverless and level set initially on why serverless and what does that bring from an advantage perspective. And a lot of the stuff that we're doing today would be all in AWS. So if you're familiar with AWS, you'll see it. If not, we can catch up afterwards to see if there's anything that's we can talk about, whether it's Azure or Google in that sense. So we'll also talk about some best practices. We'll look at end-to-end, how do we need to think about security when you're thinking about serverless security. And we'll recap with some ideas on how we can apply serverless security to that. Now, when we think about the cloud, some people, I know many years back, people are like, the cloud, that's kind of a new fad. People are going to the cloud, or S3 was released, one of the earlier services, SQS with Amazon. And people didn't really think much about it, right? Today, of course, it's a huge industry. I was just reading some stats from Gartner. This year, the expected spend is supposed to be over $206 billion in 2019. In 18, it was 1.75. So definitely people are interested in moving to the cloud. And we've really seen a trend from monolithic, where people have had these massive systems, whether it's IBMs or the Oracles of the day, to more into a microservices pattern, now into a functions as a service, right? So you don't really get to buy instances or things like that, where you would just say, I'm just going to have one function, and I'm going to fire it when I need it, and then let Amazon manage it for me. Now, there are some benefits to that. It reduces your patching cycle. It reduces your cost, where you say, I'm just going to fire based on how much I need for that particular work item. So I'm not going to really keep an instance running all the time. So serverless is becoming a very popular theme. Now, serverless doesn't apply in all cases. There are some cases where serverless may not be the right answer. So that's something that you want to think about from your company perspective. And also, security is a very interesting paradigm when you're dealing with functions. It's interesting because you don't, okay. Security is interesting because there's not really, it's ephemeral, right? So it doesn't stay there for a long time. It doesn't, you're not having to say, okay, I need to make sure that this system that's in my VPC or in my account is patched and people are looking at it and things like that. Basically the function comes up, and then once the work is done, it destroys itself for the most part. So security is a little bit of a different paradigm, and that's where it becomes very critical. How do you think about security when you're dealing with serverless? And from Amazon perspective, they talk about the shared responsibility model, and most of you know that, where Amazon says, hey, we're going to take care of security that is off the cloud, meaning that we're going to make sure that the cloud is secure. We're going to have key management. We're going to have the industry best encryption, whatnot. But it's your responsibility to make sure that the applications that you build are secure. Now, one of that is very challenging is because if somebody has a bad practice on premises, moving to the cloud doesn't really say that, oh, now I'm secure. Of course not, because now that bad practice has moved to the cloud. And it's a lot more bigger a place where the impact can be than doing it on premises. And on premises, you have enclaves, you have a backend system, and a developer has certain access. But in the cloud, somebody goes and checks a box, and your S3 is public, right? We've seen all of that happen in the past. So security it becomes a very different shift when we are dealing with the cloud, and especially serverless. And people think like, oh, I can just scale unlimited. Well, you're going to think about a lot of things you have to deal with, cost and other areas as well. So when we think about serverless, one of the questions comes up is serverless technology that people talk about. Amazon says, hey, we manage the servers for you, we patch it, we keep it secure, we make sure that we're FedRAMP compliant on all the different compliances that we have. Are they inherently secure? If I have a bad application that I'm deploying in an API gateway as an example, because I'm in the cloud, because I'm in Amazon's infrastructure or Azure's infrastructure, does that make me secure? That's something that people sometimes deal with. And what happens to the underlying hardware? How secure is it? Can I just trust it inherently? And what happens to my development? I'm developing in the cloud. I don't have any states that I can manage because it's not a system that I'm going to have access to all the time. When I deploy a function in Amazon, it stays there for the milliseconds that you're going to use it, and then once you've used it, it goes away. So if you have a state that you're trying to store for a long period of time, you have to look at externalizing it, right? So you don't want to be putting things in the function that's going to be internal to the function that your other processes are dependent on, so because you're going to lose those variables. So I just want to show a little demo. I just recorded it for the sake of time. So this one is a Lambda shell, right? So it's not showing there. I'm not sure why. I think that works. Okay. So this one, there you go. So this one is, it's actually, it's in the internet. You can go and hit it. It's lambdashell.com. What they've done is basically they've given you a command injection, right? So this is a Lambda function that's there, and it's available on the internet. So you could go there, and they have like $1,000 bug bounty and different things. So they have it in Amazon. It's a Lambda shell that you have. And it's a regular shell like what you would think if you do a command injection. That's basically what they've done. They just do a straight exec. And it's a regular computer. This is an Amazon Lambda. And you can do ls. There's the code that they wrote for this. It's it's a simple JavaScript. And it gives you information about what they're doing there. You can go look at it. And also you can look at it as it's a server, right? So basically it's got your etc. It's got your bin directory. It's got all of the regular Linux commands that you would have. And also as you're going through it, you can just say the binaries. It's got all the binaries are there. You can try to sudo. You can try to do a lot of different things. And it's got your standard etc libraries or the library areas. But also what's interesting, though, is that now that you have access to, let's say someone deploys this in the cloud. They have a program that's vulnerable from the nature that they can do a command injection, and they deployed an API gateway, and somebody gets access to that underlying hardware. So someone says, well, it's serverless, and it's going to go away. Why do I bother? Why do I care about it? But the challenge is that anytime Lambda runs, it's going to assign some parameters to it for it to work. So I just run some command. It's going to throw me some error. I can look at it. It's like a regular Unix script, Unix platform. But what happens here is that when I start looking at the environment variables, when I look and see, okay, what's the environment variable in this Lambda, it's going to start showing me things that I'm going to use in my desktop, right? So in this Lambda, I'm just doing an environment variable. So I'm seeing some interesting statements there. It's using Node.js 6.1. I can say, okay, is there any vulnerabilities in 6.1 that I can leverage? It's using the California region. So there are certain things I can get out of it. If somebody's put a password, for example, as an environment variable in Lambda, I can kind of go in and say, okay, is there the password shown there? And can I use that password for some other purposes? And now what I'm doing here is that I'm just looking at the three things that are needed to access that environment. So there's access key, secret key, and the token. Now, anytime you get into Lambda, it's going to fire up a micro container, and then it's going to assign this variable. So once you get access into a Lambda, so now I'm basically just taking the access token, the secret access key, secret key, and the token, and I'm assigning it to my desktop, basically. So I'm actually running this from here then I'm going to start taking this and applying it to my desktop. Now, they are a certain amount of time, maybe an hour, depending on how they set the role. So I will have access up to that point of time once I get access into that, into those environment variables. So at this point, all I'm doing is just taking the environment variables that I've got from the Lambda, and I'm externalizing it, right? So I'm bringing it into my computer, and I'm executing it as I would as a regular Amazon account. So I'm just basically, this will give me access to that account depending on what role they attach, right? So it really depends on the role that they attach, and it's important, and we'll talk about that, what role they had. So now that I've given all these environment variables from the Lambda in Amazon, now I can start doing regular Amazon commands. I can look to see what permissions I have. Do I have access to do maybe a list role? Can I list all the roles this Lambda has? And of course, it's basically depending on the permissions they've given, I'm getting an error there. Or I can say, what's my caller identity? What is my role that I have that I'm using as that particular Lambda user? So here he's using a basic execution role, and we'll look at the different policies in a later slide. But it just gives me some ability to run some commands. So now I know the basic execution role has access to create logs. So I'm going to go in and start creating some log groups, right? So I'm going in and creating a log group in that account. Now, this is not my account. This is an external account. And now I'm creating a log stream for that log group. And then I'm going to start posting some logs. Now, what's important in that is that when you start posting logs into the other person's account, again, we talked about phishing. We talked about different ways where people can look at it. So here's an example of a log. Again, it's just an example. So I'm taking that log event, and then basically I'm sending it to my log stream that's there. I know we've seen sometimes attacks through logs, how people can do that, or I can overwhelm that system, and I can start pumping logs in where it'll increase the cost of that account. So there's various things I can do with that. And then I get a sequence number, and then I can use that sequence number to add on more logs on that. Basically, I can automate it pretty simply and say, hey, take the sequence number and then send more logs. And I can construct a JSON that I can dump it into their CloudWatch logs. So that's just one area where sometimes people think like, okay, I'm using serverless, the underlying hardware, I don't have access to it, so it's not a big deal. What if someone gets access to my Lambda? There's a lot you can do based on the role that you have that you've given for that particular Lambda. So if you see that, and let's go back to, and if you see that, you're seeing here the roles that it has access to. So the basic execution policy is what that particular Lambda had access to. So that has these things, and of course we tried that, right? So we've given access to do some level of adding a log group, log stream, and some of those log events that we tried. Typically, when you're working in a company, you won't just say, I'm just going to give access to the logs. You would say, I'm going to give access, obviously I have SQS, or I have SNS, or I have S3. So I want Lambda to do a lot of those things with S3. And potentially somebody can say, hey, you know what, I need a SQS. And, and sometimes developers are kind of, well, I don't really want to go and find out exactly which permission I want to give. I'm just going to give a star. I'm just going to give a full access, SQS full access, or S3, or Dynamo in this case. That's huge. I mean, now you are talking giving access to your role. If somebody gets access to your Lambda function, they can externalize that. They can take the logs, or they can take the access key and the secret key and run it from their desktop. They don't need to be in your Lambda anymore. All they need is those 3 values. They take it to their desktop. Now they have access to your environment for that entire hour, or how much ever long you have. And it's a huge risk, because if someone gives like an admin, someone says, you know what, I don't really want to mess with what permissions I really need. I'm just going to give admin access to this Lambda because I'm going to do a prototype and a POC, and they deploy it to API gateway, which is external by default, unless you specify it to private. And someone can actually take over your account, because they have access to your entire account because of the admin role that you've given. I mean, of course, there's a lot of risks in doing that, whether it's log manipulation or reputation risk. Somebody can come in, get access to your account, and now they can start deleting your stuff or doing things with your account that you were not intending for them to. And again, they may not be restricted to Lambda at that point. Once they have access to your account, they can go to your EC2 instance. They can go to your all the other services that you may have running specifically in your account. So what are some principles that we want to think about when we are dealing with serverless? Especially with serverless, and a lot of these are very well known. Think about serverless as one unit of work. So whenever you're dealing with serverless, you want to make sure, am I creating this particular function, whether it's a Lambda or whether it's another piece of it, for that particular unit of work? Sometimes what happens, they say, okay, I have this monolithic application on premises, and I want to move to the cloud, and guess what? I'm going to use serverless. So I'm going to take all the functionality that I have here and put it into one big Lambda function, and I'm going to put it in the cloud. Now, that's a bad practice because you really want to decouple a lot of your states, because once you do that, now you've got a monolithic application in the cloud. That's all you've done. You've not really done any difference from doing it on premises to the cloud. You really want to understand that functions are concise. They're very simple. They're very short. They're meant for millisecond usage. They're not meant for multiple. Of course, Lambda gives you 15 minutes, but they're not really meant for long-running type functions. And then thinking about some of the infrastructure underlying. Again, we talked about you don't control that. It means that you don't have access to, you may set some environment variables, or you may set some constant variables that another function that you want to execute on top of that. You may not have that luxury of doing that in a serverless environment. You won't be able to share those kind of variables. And also think about areas where you have to design for failure. That's something that Amazon preaches quite heavily is, anything that can break will break. That's really their mantra, is that you have to make sure that you're building things that will, expecting it to break. And I'm going to skip through a little bit because I know we're running out of time. When we think about serverless, you have to think about breaking it down into multiple segments. And I like to do it this way because it helps me to see an end-to-end picture from the starting point edge layer all the way to my development environment. And this is something that can help. It's a very busy slide, but it can help when you're looking at your environment and saying, hey, I might have the edge layer, and this is what I have, and my compute layer or data, or my access, which is another key area, or development, do I do automation, do I do code scanning, things like that. Now, this can help a lot because now you're able to see end-to-end and say, where are my weaknesses? Where are my areas that I'm not secure in? You really want to think security as a layered approach. You don't want to say, hey, people can't get in unless they have a username, password, so I must be secure. No, that's a bad way of thinking because somebody in the backend system can expose it, like we talked about S3, without you knowing it and not realizing that someone on a backend, or maybe a developer or who it may be, that they accidentally checked the wrong box. So you want to really be thinking about, how do I do input standardization? That's important. How do I do gateway policies? How do I lock down who can deploy my functions into my environment? So you really want to think about from an end-to-end perspective, and hopefully that'll help know where your weaknesses are. This is just an example. We have multiple areas, and where you've got a separated account for your forensics, for your DevSecOps pipeline, and then you really want to isolate that account. Even if it's serverless, all the logs, you want to send it to this account. Also make sure that you're working with the development team to say, hey, give me logs that make sense. Don't just say internal server error 500. I need more explicit logs. Give me more specific information that says, this is because of this is a function that was running at this time, this is the time it was running, this is what it was trying to do, this is what, so it gives a lot more information about what you're actually logging. And it's important because if you just get a bunch of logs and you get it in Splunk, and you have no idea who wrote that log or who wrote that function, you're not going to have any benefit from that log. Now, I'm going to walk through a few scenarios in these areas. So when you think about a front end, what would I think of? Like in a single sign-on or IP restrictions, or even with an end-to-end protection from a TLS perspective. Specifically the bucket policies. That's very important. A lot of times, we talked about how assigning Lambda to an overarching policy can be dangerous. Same thing with the bucket policy, where you say very specifically, if I want someone to do a get object, and I want to give that particular action for this bucket. So you want to be very, very prescriptive about how you are defining what policy your bucket has. Similarly, you think about like a CloudFront. We've had situations where people use S3. They say, I'm going to serve a website through S3. But there's a better way to do it. You could do a CloudFront. It gives you a lot more areas that you can apply, like edge caching or error handling, or even dealing with redirects, HTTP to HTTPS. or the WAF protection, some of those things. So be thinking about, when you think about serverless, be thinking about areas that you want to say, hey, this is my default, what I want to do. I just want to put a website. Okay, I can just put an S3 and expose it, or I can say, what are some additional controls I can put by doing something very simple, attaching a CloudFront in front of it. Similarly, from a middleware perspective, what are some things I can do from a token that I'm going to pass between different components of my application? Input sanitization, environment variables, and what am I doing from a secrets management perspective? And am I protecting those secrets? Am I keeping them secured in that area? Now, some of the best practices, and we're going to skim through it. Some of the best practices for tokens, validation, that's very, very critical. Make sure that you're validating your tokens. Make sure you're validating what algorithm it's using. You're validating reducing the scope. If someone is giving a large scope and passing the tokens around, that's a risk factor, because now people, sometimes they may say, hey, I don't want to, have a very small scope. I want to have a larger scope so that I can pass it in multiple areas in my application. That's a risk factor, because JWT tokens can be read by anyone, and they can get access to what your scope is, what you have access to, or what you're trying to pass in those validations. Similarly, with your backend systems, very specific conditions that says, here's the access, and this is the VPC that's going to be accessing my database, and no one outside that VPC can access it. And similarly, containment. How do I contain an EC2 instance if something happens? I know our focus is on serverless, but just be thinking about, how do I contain a breach? How do I contain when somebody I know is not supposed to be there is there? So just a couple of things. Think about least privileges. A lot of times people think about, hey, I'm going to give this overarching privilege, and then I'm going to narrow it down and lock it down. Sometimes that works if you are very disciplined about how you do it, but a lot of times it's better to give very, very small segments where you say, I'm going to give read access, and then if your application says, hey, I'm failing because it needs write access, then you can give that specific privilege. So it's better to work your way up, knowing that what exact privileges does my function need. And then same thing with looking for errors that we talked about, 400 and 500 errors. So it's important that you have proper error handling that you can take action on. Securing your weakest link. A lot of times we think about, okay, I'm securing everything in the front end, and in the back end, Jenkins. What about Jenkins? It may have extra privileges that it may have access to in your deployment pipeline. And this is the last slide. So a couple of things that I would say, from the perspective of leveraging serverless security is, have a good plan when you are doing, like if you have a startup, or if you're going into Amazon, have a good plan of building guardrails. Make sure you have a good guardrail to say, we want to make sure we have a tagging policy. We want to make sure that we have, somebody puts an S3 bucket that's public, we want to have a way to lock it down unless they get privileges to do that. So have a good policy to be able to build it from the ground up. Now, security always, a lot of times, is an afterthought. You really want security to be part of your integrated process. And security versus usability is a huge topic, and maybe for another day. But that's very, very important, because if you don't make it usable, people will find ways around it, and they're going to do bad practices. So you really want to be in the space where you're making it usable, that people can take it and leverage it for the full potential it can bring. And any questions that you guys had? I know there's a lot of topics, and we skipped a few because I know we ran out of time. But any specific questions that anyone has, or afterwards I'll be here so we can talk as well. Thank you.